Jasper, thank you for having invited me. It's a wonderful opportunity to come back to Vienna and to the Kunsthistorisches, an institution that I know well, having been several times, and it's my wife's second visit here. In any event, I know you want to talk about quite a number of things, old and new, as well as simply old, and maybe museums.
2 months ago, I was sitting on the stage next to the Duke of Devonshire, who was the 12th generation of a dynasty of extraordinary collectors. No museum director is quite able to reach that level of longitude, but I think Philippe has given it as good a shot as anyone in history, and richly deserves the pedestal that he is standing on in this picture behind us. One of the reasons for this talk is I came across this book in a bookshop in London late last year, and it's, I don't know, it's not your memoirs, but it's something much more interesting than memoirs, actually. It's a walk through some of the great art places of the world, churches, chapels, museums, libraries, in the company of Martin Gayford, who came and spoke here a few years ago about Lucian Freud, with Philippe giving a series of very personal, intelligent, visceral, off-the-cuff remarks about the various things they were looking at. So I can really recommend this to any of you. And it was reading this, again, that convinced me we needed to invite Philippe here in person to listen to him. So we're going to discuss a range of topics today, some of which we discussed when we were walking through the museum today, and some of which we haven't touched on at all, so we will be treading into new territory this evening. I'd like to begin with something that I heard said recently by the director of this museum. This is the Tate Modern in London, the world's most popular museum of modern art. And the director of this museum, Chris Durkon, was here in Vienna recently to give a talk. And he told us that they recently did a survey. They recently did a survey of the visitors to Tate Modern to ask them why they came to the museum. What were their motivations for coming? And they got all the answers back and they didn't believe them. So they did the whole survey again. And they didn't believe the answers again. So they did it a third time. And they got the same results every single time. And what turned out was the main reason people came to the museum was not to learn or to be inspired or for aesthetic uplift. These were all 8%, 9%, 11%. The overwhelming reason why people came to the museum, with 41%, was to hang out. Social. To be where other people are. And this really brings me on to my first question. This is the museum where you spent a lot of time, I want to say hanging out, working very hard. In the time that you began here in 1963 and today, has something changed in terms of what the public want from an institution? Have they become these great meeting places, the sort of cathedrals, the town squares of the past? Are museums these places of today? Do we want something different today from museums?
Let me first say that I think in this instance it's important to make a distinction between what is a large encyclopedic museum with 5,000 years of recorded history represented, with, shall we say, not more than 10% of the art created after 1900, so that the survey on the Tate Modern, I think, was probably a survey of relatively younger people and people coming to see modern and primarily contemporary art. So that's a slightly different thing. At the same time, yes, I think it points to what I view, and obviously I belong to a very different generation, but as one of the key changes, if not problems, in the museum world today, which is when I started at the Metropolitan in the 1960s, most people would, let's say, before the weekend, in family, say, let us go and look at some art at the museum. The word art has almost disappeared from the vocabulary. The experience now is that of the museum experience, a little bit like an upscale mall, with the shops, with the restaurant, with all of the events and the openings and so forth. And one other example of it, and it comes more and more, if you look at the rhetoric of museums, and certainly in the United States, and now more and more at the Met, it's very much geared to visit the museum, knowing that we were going to talk a little bit later about the issue of contemporary art in an older museum. I just picked up this, it's not a brochure, it's just one sheet, but it's a current event at the Met. It's called The Artist Project. And the subtitle is, What Artists See When They Look at the Met. Not when they look at art or when they look at pictures at the Met or sculpture at the Met, it's when they look at the Met. So the rest of the rhetoric at the Metropolitan now is increasingly connect with the museum.
Is it also fair to say that, I mean, I remember as a child going to a museum meant a permanent collection. And I think for a lot of people today, going to a museum means a special exhibition. That there's a certain emphasis more on the sort of event-driven aspect of a museum's programming rather than just to go and spend half a day wandering through a permanent collection. I mean, maybe the Met is an exception in that respect because you have special exhibitions around every single corner just in your sort of permanent collection, but...
Well, I think there are two or three exceptions, and those are the ones that have to do with cities like Paris, London, New York, where you have a guaranteed, in the Met, for example, 40% of your public are tourists. It's the same at the National Gallery in London or at the Louvre. And so these are not people who say, what is the Louvre exhibiting today? Before going. They will go to the Louvre in any event. They will go to most museums in any event, and frankly here also. But there's no question that the proliferation of exhibitions has created, as you say, the special events syndrome of things that you can't miss because everybody talks about it at dinner parties and so on and so forth, and because it has a terminus. There's a date at which it ends. And so there's an incentive to go.
And how much is this Tate? I mean, this director of Tate said that they now have 160,000 members who contribute around £10 million a year to their budget through membership. So he was talking an awful lot about this notion of coming to spend time, coming to have a cup of coffee, meet a friend, go on a date, be where other people are. Is this a phenomenon which is exclusive to a museum which is free?
I was going to put it the other way. I'm very surprised that there are that many members at the Tate because the Tate is free. Right. The reason a place like the Metropolitan has many members, I think it's 250,000 more or less, is that it is not free. It's quasi-free in the sense that you have to pay something, but you may pay what you will. But let's say MoMA, which is I think now $25 a person, a membership is a way, if you are a repeat visitor, if you go frequently, for $75 or $100 a year, you have your membership and you come as many times as you want, and you are all good at numbers. That's a very good investment. So I'm surprised at the high number at the Tate, which is free. So what do they get in exchange? Invited to openings? Again, that's the social thing.
There's an entire floor with wonderful views of St. Paul's Cathedral, which they keep for their members, but I'm sure that's not the reason people join. But
no, but Gertrude Stein might have. Gertrude Stein was the great collector of Picasso and others, American living in Paris, used to say that she loves museums, especially the view from the inside out.
Gertrude Stein also said something amazing about museums. Alfred Barr, who was the first director of MoMA, asked her if she would leave her collection to MoMA, and she said, "My dear, you can be modern and you can be a museum, but you can't be both." Which I thought was really considering she was saying it to the director of the Museum of Modern Art, I thought was kind of brilliant. I guess you have to be Gertrude Stein to say something like that. We were talking about this a little bit at lunch today. This is a huge question, and you're going to be pressed to answer this in any less than 2 hours. What are the really great challenges facing a museum director today, at this specific moment in time? Whether it's a museum like this, a museum like this, a museum like Tate Modern?
I'm going to give you a strange answer, and I think probably the greatest challenge is, how do you stay the same? How do you avoid the pitfall and all the traps of following every fashion of the day, of doing exhibitions and installations that in a way serve the flavor of the day, like an ice cream store? Museums are, by definition, repositories. They are essentially repositories of works of art. They are the place where people can go to see works of art. You no longer have, although there are a few palazzi in Rome and so forth that are now quasi-open to the public, essentially the majority of people, if they want to see art, with the exception of a few collectors, go to museums. So we are in a new age of the age of museums where you have come to see art. But as such, they are first and foremost the repositories of works of art. And for me, I still, in an old-fashioned way, would put the issue of conservation and preservation absolutely first. I've even occasionally given lectures in which I've indicated that, in my view, even if you close a museum's doors to the public, you remain a useful institution, like a library. Not every book is of use only at the moment at which it is being read. Now, of course, what distinguishes the great collections of the past, let's say the Habsburg collections, from today in the museum is the issue of access. They are accessible to a large number of people, not in the old days simply to the conoscenti, to the people who were literate, and to fellow princes and fellow kings and emperors. So access is what distinguishes it. And the moment you get into program and programmation, this is where maybe my age, my generation, I'm going to be 80 soon, makes the difference with yours, which is that I think I don't need an excuse. I don't need an event in order to want to come and look at works of art, because I still come and look at works of art. Why did I enter museums? And I say this in my book. The container, except when it's beautiful like this, doesn't interest me. It's the contents that interest me. I entered the museum world in order to be close to art, to works of art. And I think, in a way, the challenge of the future has to do with the issue of time, and the issue of how much time does the casual visitor of today give to the contemplation of a work of art. And it's, again, another trap, and it's the trap of the eye, which can apprehend an object in, as we say, the blink of an eye. You can look for 2 or 3 seconds at a painting by Rubens or Titian or Bruegel in the galleries, turn around and basically describe it on a superficial manner pretty well. If you want to listen to a Razumovsky quartet, you are in your seat and you have to listen movements 1 through 4 seriatim. And so the great trap of museums is that you can see things and the majority of people think they've seen them. So the challenge is how to tell and how to indicate to visitors that a searching, long look is essential. And this is where, and I don't want to run into a speech, but I know you were going to ask me a little bit about the notion of the new digital age. And here, I'm going to become an apostate, if you will, my field, and to say that, in a way, the new technologies, the new high-definition qualities, what is it called, Google Art Project, and so forth, are very seductive. And the way in which you can look at works of art, essentially pictures for the moment on the Google Art project, is quite remarkable, and in many ways more satisfying than actually looking at an original. And I would say this, although obviously the authentic for me is essential. But in writing this book with Martin Gayford, we never got to Vienna. It happens to be that it's wherever we were. We kept noting that the pictures we wanted to see, there was always, if they were well-known pictures, a knot of people, a large group of people in front of them. If they were not, you always had the sense that 2 or 3 couples were waiting for you to move on. And this sense, you've got to move on to let the next person see it. So time yourselves. How many of you spend actually 1 minute, 60 seconds in front of a picture? That is a very long time nowadays in the museum. Rudolph II, looking at his Bruegels, by looking at them day after day, that's the same as repeat visits. So repeat visits are a way, in fact, of looking searchingly at pictures. And I've forgotten his name. There was a professor at Harvard who wrote a book on Poussin, on 2 pictures of Poussin. His name will come back to me at the wrong time, which is where he for 6 months is going back to look at the same picture of Poussin and how differently it looks to him. Not only the picture itself, but how you feel. If you're tired, if you're hungry, the eye is directly tied not only to the brain, but to the body.
No. I mean, I don't need to ask any questions this evening. I had a question about entertainment in museums, but I'm going to skip straight on because I want to get onto this notion of the digital. When museums were first created, there was no such thing as an easily reproducible media. There was no photography. When you began at the Met, there was no such thing as the internet. If somebody wanted to take part of the art home with them, they either had to go to the bookshop and buy some postcards, or they had to look at it really long and burn it onto their brain. Now, there's a new rhythm in museums, which we feel here, everywhere. Everywhere you go, snapshot, Instagram it, this lady in orange taking a selfie of herself in front of the Mona Lisa. I mean, this is an extreme example, but you're hearing about it everywhere now. The National Gallery in London has had to ban those sort of sticks because they're actually, just weapons, basically. Is this entire I mean, obviously I'm talking about a very narrow part of the digital and its implications for educational programming, for marketing. This project that you mentioned at the Met are just beginning. There are extraordinary things happening in terms of the access to archives, entire collections now being online. It's extraordinary for scholars and public. You can take an entire tour of a museum now without leaving your armchair at home. In your opinion, someone who began his career before this new world of social media began, and looking at the situation now, has this advent of the digital, in your opinion, has it presented more problems to museums, or are these actually opportunities?
I would favor the second. There are likely to be opportunities if they are well used. I don't think it would have made much sense at the end of the 15th century to decide that Gutenberg's invention should not be used and that you should go back to the scriptorium and write everything out. The digital media, I think if one remembers that it is the medium, notwithstanding McLuhan, and not the message, I think can be used very successfully. I mentioned already the high definition images on Google Images. There is also the liberation for the designers and curators of the proliferation of texts in galleries. If you're able to take your device and dial the number on a label and you want a great deal more information, you will receive it digitally. And I think that's far better than long labels. You have to have, obviously, the minimum amount of information to identify what the work of art is. But there are so many other things that the digital world does and can do. But my real answer to you is the following. One of the reasons, there are a few, I'm happy to discuss them if you want, but one of the reasons I left the Met, I was not asked to leave, there's no age at which you need to leave an institution, and the trustees seem to be very happy still with me at the Met. But one of the reasons I left is I had the sense that the Met should do a great deal more in the new technologies. And I had both a lack of personal interest and a lack of knowledge in the new technologies. And I knew I was not the right person to lead them into the many arenas which I could not imagine them, because I don't need them personally. But that's irrelevant to the large number of people who are not art historians and trained.
One of the things that we talked about today briefly was this idea that 100 years ago, the relationship between a museum and its audience was very much one way. A museum was an educational authority which spoke to its visitors, which awed them and inspired them and instructed them. But it was very much a one-way relationship, if we're being a little bit reductive, compared to the relationship that exists today through the advent of critiquing, asking questions. Everyone has suddenly become a reviewer, posting images. There's very much a sense of a two-way relationship having developed. It's of course always been a two-way relationship because visitors have always taken something away from a museum. But there's a sense that the audience almost has a less passive role in an institution's life now than it perhaps had even 50 years ago.
I think you're right in the sense that it's less passive, but I somehow think, and just watching people coming into museums such as this one, or the Met, or the Louvre, and so forth, that people rely on authority. They expect, subconsciously, if you will, that what they will see and what they will read or hear about the works of art on view, that the choice, the selection of the works of art on view has been done by experts. I don't think anybody would feel comfortable in the chaos of an anarchical curatorial conversation in which all of you can be curators. And in fact, I object a great deal to many of the programs museum has where on their website said you can be your own curator. That diminishes the notion of expertise in which I believe. I would not want anybody to tell me you can be your own surgeon. No, thank you. I'd like to go to a good hospital and a good surgeon, and I want to have a sense of comfort and rely on the expertise of a museum, which does not mean that you have to hang up your critical faculties with your umbrella and your coat at the door when you come in. Everybody brings something else to a work of art, and all of you, each one of you, actually sees every single work of art in a different way. And because we are not living in the time, this is a collection of older works of art, not contemporary, except when you make special events. And that's why you're here, where every person actually reinvents in their own way a work of art. Our response is a reinvention of a work of art. We are no longer living in the Renaissance, and the way in which we look at a Mantegna or a Titian is not the way in which they looked. And I think, and many have written about the subject, is that we actually cannot put ourselves back in that mood. There are a few places, we talked about it at lunch, the Scuola di San Rocco in Venice, where you are suddenly surrounded by Tintoretto, is one of the few places, I think, where actually you are almost back into 16th century Venice, because there is no distraction of other things. One is completely surrounded, immersed in the art, and finding a way to invite a visitor to be immersed in a work of art is one of the big challenges of museums. It's the great paradox. We want a lot of visitors. You want to tell the government we need more funds because we have a lot of visitors. And at the same time, we all say we want that sublime colloquy, that conversation à deux between the work of art and the visitor, which you cannot have if you are not deux, but 200. So it's
the great trick of getting a lot of visitors in the door and then making them disappear once they're in the building somehow. That would be the real trick.
Yes, it would. But you know, the other thing, it has to do with marketing and the way museums market themselves. The Louvre, which is one of the great museums in the world, if you stick to the piano nobile, you are surrounded constantly by groups with what we have, well, like this, and with little flags. But go up one flight of stairs to the room with all the jardins, you are alone. So part of the education of the large museums of the world is to educate their publics to go to different places. So we should stop, as I say in the book, as in the Mauritshuis, when I approached the museum, and the entire facade was covered with banners of Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring. And by the time I got inside the museum, surrounded by more posters, mugs of coffee with her, I didn't want to see the picture anymore. I mean, it had become an image. It had lost all its value of the surprise. Also, the picture is small and the banners are large. So the museums are at fault in promoting only a very few things because they believe that is what will bring people in. We have to find a way to promote something more generalized, and that is the challenge. Art is difficult. This is not entertainment. A Titian is not entertainment. A Rubens is not entertainment. And so how do you communicate? You can't say to your public relations office, go out there and tell people art is difficult. This just isn't going to work as a message. And at the same time, that aura needs to be created somehow in the museum where people realize, and they do to a certain degree, because there is a sense of reverential quality to people who walk in, especially to a building like this one. It's the new religion, the religion of aesthetics. So we have secularized religious works, but we've given them a kind of a new religion in the world of art and aesthetics. How you convey this to a large number of people, I have absolutely no idea.
I thought you were going to tell us at the end of all of that.
No.
Okay. I read you mentioned the word accessible earlier, and accessibility is this sort of buzzword that comes up in museum conferences all the time. There was a really interesting quote in the New York Times last week in an article about museums and the digital, and the quote was, "In the present age of saturation marketing and inescapable surveillance, it may be that one of art's most radically self-sustaining moves will be to go increasingly for inaccessibility, to find ways to exist beyond the point at which digital media can fully capture it." Tate came up with a slogan recently, "The questions that Google can't answer." And it's about what art is able to provide you that can't be snapshotted, bought in the shop. It is something else, which is what what looking or sitting and drawing a sculpture all day long, sketching something, that sort of thing that it gives you.
I'm very encouraged by what you say, by the article, I think it was by Holland Cotter, and by what the Tate has written, and I think more museums should do this. You mentioned sketching. There are actually museums that forbid sketching, which is insane. I think Goethe once said, "Das habe ich nicht gesehen, habe nicht gezeichnet, habe ich nicht gesehen." And that's so true. And also there's the element of time. If you are drawing and sketching, a lot more than simply clicking a phone. But I'm encouraged by what you say. I think so. That's the first step. What Google won't give you, what the digital age won't give you, is pretty good.
When I telephoned Philippe in New York a couple of months ago, where we had to come up with a plan of what we were going to talk about tonight, Philippe's suggestion, when he saw my email signature, was that we talk about this recent phenomenon of contemporary art finding its way into wonderful old historical museums such as this. It's a subject very close to my own heart. And we've got a few images. This is the Palace of Versailles in 2008, when they mounted an extraordinary exhibition of works by the American artist Jeff Koons all over the palace. They repeated it 2 years later with an exhibition of the Japanese artist Takashi Murakami. And I'm just going to leave this slide on the screen. I'm going to read you a quote by Nicholas Penny, the director. Is he still the director? He's got another month or two.
Gabriele Finaldi of the Prado is now director of the National Gallery.
The former director of the National Gallery, Nicholas Penny, who is not known to be a friend of contemporary art. Nick said, "It is time to protest against the crass policy which is now the standard, almost obligatory way of affirming relevance in museums and historic buildings. No one today visiting an old interior filled with fine 18th century furniture or a collection of Greek or Roman antiquities will be surprised to encounter a colossal, shiny plastic toy or the eerie religiosity of a slow-motion video." I think he's talking about Bill Viola there. "Despite the apparent popular success of such exercises, they seldom please anyone deeply attached to the old art, which is thus supposedly given a new life. The appeal to the contemporary artist is, we suspect, that proximity with the old enhances the modernity of the new, whereas when placed beside the avant-garde of the last century, the new tends to seem tame or stale." It's quite emphatic.
Well, he expresses his point of view, and what he's really indicating is the issue of in what direction does the arrow point. And this, for me, is something that I struggle with. And here, my own experience, and mine is strictly mine, this is not canonical truths coming from on high, is that I find the insertion of contemporary art, and we're not now talking about artists playing the role of curators. That's a whole other thing. I'm talking about the insertion of actual works of contemporary art into the museum as more revelatory of what the contemporary artist is doing than what it might suggest about the older art. I have yet to see an installation of contemporary art next to old masters or antiquities that made me look at the old master or the antiquity very differently. In fact, there was an exhibition a few years ago at the British Museum on extraordinary works of the Ice Age, 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, in which, because a number of 20th century, not necessarily contemporary, but 20th century artists had been influenced and looked at them, you had drawings of Brancusi or Braque and others in proximity to these extraordinary works of 40,000 years. To me, it could have been an exhibition with extraordinary poignancy and power, and it was simply a distraction, and it reduced the notion of the creativity of human beings 40,000 years ago to, yes, there are forms that are repeated, whether in the 20th century or 40,000 years ago. And to me, it was superficial and a complete distraction. Here you showed in Versailles Jeff Koons and Murakami. There's a slight difference between the two. The Jeff Koons I saw. Murakami I did not see. In the case of Jeff Koons, the curators brought a number of works of Jeff Koons and installed them in the galleries of Versailles. The works were not created with Versailles in mind. There was no real dialogue between the artist and Versailles. Murakami, on the other hand, as I understand it, did create a number of works thinking in terms of their being shown in Versailles. That, to me, is already much more legitimate and interesting, the reaction of a contemporary artist to an older artist. If today we had an opportunity to ask Rubens to reinstall the Titians here, who would say no to that opportunity? We would want to see things through the eyes of Rubens. You did this through the eyes of Ed Ruscha. There is now, or was recently, in the Khorsabad Gallery at the Louvre, a huge convex, one of these steel mirrors done by the great sculptor Anish Kapoor. And it was fabulous. You saw, in fact, the lamassus, these are the winged bulls, such as those destroyed recently in Iraq at Nimrud, and you saw them upside down, right side up. It was fascinating as a work of modern art. What did it do for me in terms of looking at the art of the ancient Assyrians? I have to confess, for me, the arrow continued to be one way. So I know for other people, the arrow goes both ways. This is not a new thing. As you know, in 1945, was it, or 48, that the Grande Galerie in the Louvre was hung with works of Picasso. And it's not new. The French provincial museums actually did this quite a bit. I like the notion of a contemporary artist rearranging galleries. Fred Williams do we have the different one?
I mean, these Versailles exhibitions caused a total firestorm. The French public, obviously the French royalists and monarchists went absolutely nuts. There were petitions for the people to lose their jobs. I mean, these were really incendiary exhibitions. I wanted to get onto also the notion of permanent collections, and there's a lovely slide which you contributed in a moment, the Otto Dick slide. This is a lovely moment that MoMA did a number of years ago, where they juxtaposed this wonderful painting on the right by Paul, horrible slide, I'm sorry, by Paul Cézanne, The Bather, from 1885, one of the very first works in MoMA's collection, so one of the cornerstones of modern art. And interestingly, one of the very first paintings ever made from a photograph. And they juxtaposed it with a photograph by Reneke Dijkstra of a young teenage boy on a beach in Odessa in the Ukraine. And this was one example in a permanent collection where actually, you made the suggestion that perhaps Dijkstra even had this Cézanne in mind when she created this photograph, possibly. But this was, for me, something which I actually found fascinating when I walked through this exhibition at MoMA, and it didn't denigrate my reading of the Picasso at all. On the contrary, I found it really fascinating because the gaze of the photograph, he's got such a contemporary kind of washed out teenager look to him. So you can, even though the pose is timeless, he sort of has something to him which anchors him very much in today. You came up with an even more example, which is this, something you saw in Detroit.
Yes, the example you just showed, in my view, is a legitimate example of using the collection, showing the formal relationships, and as well a kind of a psychological approach to the subject. The Otto Dix and the Netherlandish picture also of a man with a pink made perfect sense to hang together. not simply because Otto Dix painted a man with a pink, but Otto Dix had seen such Netherlandish pictures. He was clearly actually doing à la manière de a Netherlandish picture, and this, I think, makes one think. And this is one instance, actually, where the relationship is more than just formal, where it's also an approach to the representation of a human being. It goes on many different levels, and I think it does make one think. It probably made one think, why is he holding a pink, looking at the Otto Dix, and then suddenly wondering why is the man in the Netherlandish holding a pink, and there's a whole iconography. We all know the reasons why you hold a pink or whatever else it might be. And here, I think you have an instance of the arrow going both ways. But you have an instant of the arrow going both ways, old to new, new to old, because Otto Dix is still working in the old tradition. He is modern, but he is working in the old representational tradition. He is still before the total rupture, Duchamp, and later, in my view, in any event, of tradition. So you still have the frame and the picture as a window onto an aspect of the world, which disappears with contemporary art.
And of course, when we talk about old and new, everyone assumes we're talking about the new being very new. But actually, this was an exhibition that many of you will have seen in Venice 2 years ago at the Palazzo Ducale, where they juxtaposed Manet's Olympia with Titian's Venus of Urbino. And of course, there's a great deal of history which separates these two pictures. And I think it was, I don't know if it's the first time for a very long time they've been together.
It has to have been, because it's the first time that the Orsay has actually lent that
it,
picture. Right. The great advantage and the wonderful juxtaposition here is we have seen so many images, we are so accustomed to seeing Manet's Olympia that it's become an old master, that it's become part of our repertoire of images of old paintings. And by seeing it next to the Titian, and Manet had seen the Titian, Manet had been to the Prado and seen other Titians of the same sort, suddenly seeing them side by side, you realize the modernity of the Manet much more clearly. So this is, I think, an excellent example of an intelligent juxtaposition of pictures.
Another aspect of this, of the way in which contemporary art is sort of finding its way into historical buildings, this is the Salle de Bronze at the Louvre. And the Louvre have a history of commissioning contemporary artists to make permanent interventions on the museum's architecture. Delacroix, Ingres, Georges Braque, Anselm Kiefer,
and Twombly.
And Cy Twombly. Here, if some of you know Twombly's work, you actually may not have guessed that this is a Twombly, because it doesn't, it's not characteristic, but this is an extremely bold gesture to give a ceiling permanently. I mean, of course, into over it one day, potentially, but to give a permanent piece, like giving the ceiling of the cupola here to a contemporary artist, an incredibly bold gesture.
Well, the spandrels in parts of the building are by Klimt.
This was at the time that the building was, they're not, yeah.
Well,
it's happening 100 years later.
You have ceilings of Lebrun, you have ceilings of Delacroix, the Galerie d'Apollon, but this is marginal. I mean,
is this something successful?
Have become more part of the building, not of the exhibits below, and I don't find that shocking at all. I think it's very successful in that gallery. It lightens it up quite wonderfully.
One thing that always bothers me is that historical museums get a lot of criticism when they borrow contemporary art and start showing it. But contemporary museums are very happy to borrow historical art. There are several contemporary exhibitions in Vienna at the moment that have historical objects in them. And in my opinion, there's a clumsiness in the contemporary world's handling of historical art that is far more outrageous than the clumsiness of the historical world's handling of contemporary art, if that made any sense at all. This was actually a good example. This is an exhibition of the Dutch painter Marlene Dumas at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. And she was asked to have a one-person exhibition, and she asked to show her work alongside Dutch Golden Age portraits. And the title of the exhibition was Marlene Dumas and the Old Masters, which in itself is just such a, ridiculously empty sort of name to give to something. But it was an example, and there are other examples. These are the Tintorettos at the Venice Biennale 4 years ago, where they brought in these extraordinary paintings from San Giorgio Maggiore into the very first room of the Central Pavilion in Venice. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen this. I still don't know what I think of this, if this was brilliant, if this was completely idiotic. I know what she was trying to do, but this relationship between old and new, we talked about which way the arrow goes. And I think it's also really interesting to examine the instances in which the modern and contemporary world is borrowing historic things. I think they do it to sprinkle as much stardust over their modern things as happens the other way around. I think there's an equal sort of culpability to the way that some of these projects are done.
There is. There's also, in this particular instance to me, a lack of faith on the part of curators of the old master, in this case Tintoretto, having any effect on a visitor in its normal sight. Here, there is, to me, a distortion, a complete distortion, because first of all, the walls are pure white. This is the white cube. This is the kind of wall in which you exhibit contemporary, modern and contemporary art. And the entire installation was surrounded by contemporary installations. So is the curator, as you say, the question mark is, were they trying to show that Tintoretto was modern? Actually, what I see is a great, dark, gloomy rectangle on a white wall. It has removed all of the life that Tintoretto gave it in its own setting. There's a point at which you cannot, like an animal in a zoo, you cannot cage and completely transform the setting of a work of art. Already, works of art are transformed to a certain degree by being brought from churches and palaces into museums. But that's already a historical truth. This, to me, I did not see it, but certainly on the basis of the photographs and what I know of it, makes no sense, and all of the explanations I've read about it also made no sense. It was almost a kind of a desperate effort. It also put the painting at risk. I don't know how many there is. You should, if you want, go on the website of the Biennale, and what it took to move that picture, put it on 2 gondolas, tie it with rope, the risks taken for this moment of I don't know what, to me were simply not legitimate.
The title of her biennial was Illuminations, and she wanted an artist who dealt with light, a Venetian artist who worked with light at the center of what she was doing. It's interesting what you say about the white wall, so on. When Ed Ruscha was invited to work with the collection here, he chose a very pale grey wall for the exhibition, and he actually asked if he could take all of the paintings out of their frames. And our conservators just said, no way, none of them are coming out of their frames. But it was an interesting exercise, as he wanted to hang an old master exhibition in a contemporary manner. And he actually did do it. He hung the paintings with a lot of space between them, much lower than they normally are, with a lot of space. He used modern vitrines for the objects. And it's something that a lot of people remarked on when they came, is that they hadn't seen the collection hung. It just had a very different feel to it, simply because of the sort of devices that he had employed in the wall color, the height, and so on. So
I agree with you that it's not unproblematic here. One thing you touched on is this notion of contemporary artists working as curators. And it's something we do. We did it with Ed. We will do it next year with Edmund de Waal. I've got two examples. This is the first one. This is the wonderful artist Jorge Pardo. And Jorge Pardo was invited to reinstall the pre-Columbian collection of LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And this is a permanent, I believe it's a permanent.
Michael Govan has told me that it was going to be a 6-month installation. Pardo is Mexican, and most of the works in the room are Mexican, so there was also that nexus. But he found it so successful, and the public found it so successful, that he's kept it up for the moment. It can't be permanent because LACMA is about to destroy the building, thank God, it's monstrous, and build a whole new one. I saw the installation at LACMA, and it was interesting in the sense that I was able both to register the design talents of Jorge Pardo, who's a fine artist, but I could still see the works themselves. So while it certainly was original, this would be a case to me of why not. There is, the Chinese artist Sai Guojiang, who does these gunpowder paintings. I was recently lecturing in Houston, Texas, in the Houston Museum, where they have a collection of early archaic bronzes and ceramics, first millennium BC China, until the Warring States, essentially. And they commissioned Sai Guojiang using his gunpowder technique to create evocations of Chinese landscapes all over the walls. And it worked. I mean, it was really quite wonderful. There you had a Chinese artist, ancient Chinese works, old and new. The new, of course, was an evocation of the old because he was imitating Sung landscape painting. So I think the answer we can give, in a way, is that, like everything else in life, is how intelligently are you doing it? So there's no prohibition, but it has to be done right. It has to be calibrated just right.
There's one last example. I don't know if any of you, I didn't see this, and Philippe didn't see it either, but this was an exhibition at the Hermitage in 2011. The British artist Anthony Gormley was invited to reinstall works from the classical collection of the Hermitage. And what he did was he raised the floor by about 5 feet and created an artificial floor so that suddenly visitors were on exactly the same level as all as the classical sculptures which had once towered above them. So their physical relationship with the objects became completely different. And I didn't see it. I wish I had seen it, because this to me looks, this is a non-permanent installation. It was there for 3 months. And in terms of how it makes you look at something differently, the sense of theater that it evokes, the lack of harm that I think it does to its subjects, I think it's a highly intelligent, playful, I think it ticks a lot of boxes, something like this.
I think this is actually one case. I have not seen it either. I had seen the photographs, and I didn't understand, seeing the photographs, of what had happened, that the tall pedestals had been covered. So this is why I didn't send you the photograph. I didn't know what I was looking at. But this is one case where possibly you are actually looking, the arrow might go the other way, because you are suddenly on the same level. In museums and everywhere, you see the works on high pedestals. But if you think about it, the Greek kouros was never on a pedestal. The kouros is a grave figure that was in the cemeteries in Greece, I know one of your classicists is here tonight to correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect actually like this pretty much on eye level, in which case one is seeing the work very differently. And this seems to me smart because it's also impermanent. And here, I know you don't have the slide of it, but I'm sure many of you have been to Paris in the last 15 years and have walked up and down the Rue de Rivoli. And some of you may even like that wonderful classical building in Paris that belonged to the Duc d'Orléans, which is the Palais Royal. Now, the Palais Royal, where Colette lived and wrote many of her books, now has a permanent installation of a whole series of columns with the black and white stripes by the French sculptor Buren. I remember the first time I saw them. They had been commissioned by the Mitterrand's Minister of Culture, Jacques Lang. And I had a meeting with Jacques Lang shortly after they came out, and I said, this is very interesting, this contrast of Buren and the modern columns and so forth, and different heights with the building. How long is this lasting? And he said to me, how long? They are in 8 feet of concrete, and this is considered to be absolutely a permanent installation, and they are still there. So here, the big question is, at what point does a permanent installation so completely transform the building that it becomes a travesty of itself? I teach at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, and I teach classes actually in which I talk about such transformations of works of art, the physicality of the work of art and what it undergoes, and I find that 90% of my students approve of the Buren. And then I find that, as I go to Paris quite frequently, that I've actually gotten used to the Burens. And so there's a whole factor of the moment that instant of shock and of confrontation disappears, that we all actually become accustomed to things. Now, for me, I enjoy the Burens because there are some very low ones and I can sit on them. I have a bad back, so I love sitting on them. But I now find that actually I can see the building and in my mind actually remove the Burens from sight. It's an interesting phenomenon, but the notion of permanent versus temporary and how far can you go with the permanent. I mean, think of history of how many buildings have been transformed, torn down, Renaissance wing added to a medieval palace and so on and so forth. I think that's, to a certain degree, we can't be too many purists too much, and we have to accept certain transformations, even ones dictated by a Minister of Culture.
I think this is actually the best thing that Antony Gormley ever did, which is rather rude to Antony Gormley, considering it doesn't involve any of his own work, really. But I agree with you on the Buren. I had the opposite reaction with the Buren. I loved it the first time I saw it, and it increasingly annoys me. I used to walk through the gardens of the Palais Royal on my way to work every day. I used to just bump into them, and it just began to completely infuriate me. So I've gone the other way with that. I loved it the first time I saw it, and now it drives me nuts. And I think he's actually a very good artist, but this particular project I'm not love at all.
You quoted Nicholas Penny. I want to give you a brief quote. I don't know if you saw at the National Gallery in London the installation made by Michael Landy of a whole number of works that actually made a clanking noise, because there's the issue of silence also and of noise in museums. And what is interesting is the reaction of Michael Landy when he was asked by, I think it was Neil MacGregor probably still, to do an installation of these very noisy machines in the National Gallery in London. And he is said to have told Neil, before we go any further, can I make sure you know what it is that I actually do? I mean, do you really know what you're getting into? almost as if he himself was skeptical about whether he ought to engage in a conversation with the old masters of the National Gallery.
It's 8:10. We're a little too long. I'm going to finish with one last question to you, Philippe, which is the next project that we do in this building, which involves bringing something relatively new into the building, is an exhibition this autumn of the American artist Joseph Cornell. He is a name relatively unfamiliar to an Austrian audience. Can you just, in a nutshell, excite these wonderful people about the exhibition that is coming here in the autumn? We're recording this, so this will end up on a website or something.
When Jasper told me he was doing an exhibition of Cornell, I said, it is absolutely brilliant. And brilliant because it is apt, because it is appropriate. Cornell, in a sense, his boxes and his installations in miniature are little Kunstkammers. And so you're doing it in a museum with a fabulously beautiful reinstalled Kunstkammer, and the notion of those agglomeration of works, and in his case of objects. He is a great poet. He should be far better known. And I think it's wonderful to have it here.